Hi, everyone. This is Roberto Rodriguez. Welcome to the Plain Language Training. We will wait a couple of minutes and have more attendees join us. Perfect. Let's do about one more minute here. We're still getting more attendees in, so we'll start in 1 minute. Okay, perfect. So welcome everyone to the Plain Language Training. This event will also be held on May 27th, this Thursday, for those of the attendees who couldn't make it today. We are very, very excited to have this training since the plain language can be used to help everyone better communicate with the public and with each other. Today's training will include understanding what plain language is, defining the three main types of literacy skills, explaining the proposed causal pathways between plain language and improved outcomes, apply plain language principles to evaluate written content, demonstrate techniques to verbally facilitate and check for understanding. Also, throughout the training, Jennifer, our presenter today, will be asking for some interaction. The chat is closed, but you can submit questions and comments through the Q&A, and we will monitor them throughout the training. We will also leave about 10 minutes at the end of the training for any type of questions or comments. So Jennifer Pierce is a consultant that specializes in plain language. Jennifer brings over 20 years of experience partnering with the diverse array of clients. Jennifer work has earned national recognition, garnering Clearmark Award of Distinction from the Center of Plain Language in Washington, D.C. Her previous experience includes pioneering Sutter's Health award-winning health literacy program. Jennifer also holds a Master's of Public Administration from Cal State East Bay, a Bachelor from the University of California, San Diego. So we are excited to have Jennifer here. I was lucky enough about a year ago to be in one of Jennifer's trainings where I learned a lot, and I hope everyone here will as well. Without further ado, Jennifer, please take over.
Wonderful. Thank you, Roberto. Appreciate the opportunity to be here today. If anything pops up and technical wise, you can't hear me, feel free to interrupt. It is a privilege to be back. My last opportunity to train at Disability Rights California was in 2019. Not that much happened for any of us in 2020, but for some of you, this may be a refresher. For others, it may be new. Regardless, I welcome your questions throughout. Feel free, I know everyone I believe is muted, but feel free to use the Q&A. Roberto and Jenny have kindly agreed to help monitor that. I will try to check it throughout to make sure that I am answering your questions. Very quickly, we'll go over the, let's see here, best way to advance our slides. We'll go over the agenda. And the most important thing is you'll have a break. No one looks forward to a 2-hour training. I know, I've been in them. So we will essentially go for 1 hour of some interaction, but a lot of me telling you about, the plain language, we call them attitudes. What's the philosophy we bring to communication in the plain language field? And then going over some of the principles of plain language, which I refer to as plain language knowledge. And then a little bit on testing for audience feedback, an essential component of developing plain language communication. We'll take a break right around the top of the hour, around 1 o'clock. It's 10 minutes, but it's still a break. We'll come back and spend about 40 minutes looking at your materials through the lens of what you've already learned. And I believe all of you received via email before this training a plain language tip sheet. And if you have that handy, you may want to use it during that second half when we're applying plain language skills. Because it will help you sort of check your tip sheet and then look at the content. We'll go through it together and see, what's going well. And I can tell you, your organization's doing a lot really well. And then where there's room for further improvement. And then of course, at the end, we'll have questions. I do intend for this to be interactive. I have some sections that are very intentional for that, but also if you have questions throughout, particularly anything that needs to be clarified, please put them in the Q&A, and I'll try to get to those. So Roberto talked about our learning objectives, so I won't spend time on this slide. I believe all of you will get this presentation following the training as well, or maybe following the second round, which is Thursday for those that couldn't attend today. So my hope is that you can just be present and listen and not be writing everything down, because you will get it. And our brains, adult brains, don't do well writing things down and listening at the same time. So I wanted to start today by sort of normalizing why it is we're all here. Why do you have to spend 2 hours out of your day listening to me talk about plain language? And just start with some of the practical reasons for using plain language. First of all, the most important is that engagement requires understanding. And if you are advocating on behalf of a group of individuals, if you're speaking to anyone, if you're writing anything for anyone, you want them to engage with what you're saying, what you're asking them to do, and what you've written down. If they don't understand what you're saying, what you're asking them to do, or what you've written down, they cannot engage. And I don't know how many people on this webinar speak German, but I'm going to use it as an example. So play along, pretend you don't speak German. But if I were speaking German and none of you spoke German, you would not be very engaged in what I was saying because you couldn't understand it. And it's as simple as that. When we speak in complex terms, people cannot understand, and that precludes them from being able to engage. So it's just, is the front door to your business locked or is it wide open? That's the main reason for using plain language. Second reason we'll get into is the fact that you cannot tell by looking. And that is something I'm sure you all appreciate more than your average audience, considering disabilities come in many shapes and forms, and you can't always tell by looking. And I have some statistics to share with you around that. And the third piece, and I understand we have attorneys on the line today, or on the training, is the fact that it's the law. And that may be news to some people, others not so much. It is federal law, but it's starting to seep into state law. So we'll talk about that. So this is the you can't tell by looking point. When you're communicating, communication 101 is you have to know your audience. Does your audience speak German? If not, don't speak in German. Is your audience coming at what you're saying with great skepticism? Are they already in a place where they're not ready to hear certain things? Knowing the temperature of your audience, it's reading the room, is essential. And so what I want to talk about here briefly is what we know about adult literacy in the United States. And primarily we're talking about adults age 16 to 65. There have been national assessments of adult literacy done. I think 1993 was the first one. The most recent round, we have data from 2017. And in a nutshell, not much has changed. Literacy levels have stayed relatively static. Numeric literacy, dealing with numbers and people's ability to do that, have stayed relatively static. And we've now recently started measuring people's ability to function in what's called a technology-rich environment. So how do you get information off of a computer, since everything is on the computer now? How do people do that? And even those skills have stayed relatively static. So we'll talk about each of those domains. But the takeaway here is roughly 1 in 5 adults, 43 million adults, have low literacy skills. And I'm going to ask you to look at, we've got on the screen level 1, level 2, level 3, and then the last 2 heads represent levels 4 and 5. The reality is level 2 folks are on the bubble. They are not quite the low literacy group, but they're not far off. So taken together, if you're in level 1 or below and level 2, we're talking about 61% of adults. So over half struggle with literacy. What does that mean? What does it mean to struggle with literacy skills? It's the ability to understand, evaluate, use, and engage with written texts to participate in society, achieve your goals, and develop knowledge and potential. And we'll talk about what the domains of literacy in a few minutes, but we're primarily talking about navigating words when we talk about literacy. And the assessment actually was, people could be, the assessment was administered in English, but people could be interviewed in English or Spanish. So this was accessible to individuals for whom English was not their first language, where Spanish was, but we're talking about navigating in an English-speaking environment, which as much as we try to translate things in this country, we are nowhere near where we need to be to provide a comprehensive experience for Spanish speakers. So examples of tasks that people that 61% of adults in this country find difficult: comparing and contrasting information, paraphrasing, or making low-level inferences. So, and it's not just folks who aren't born here. Of those in the low literacy level, 2/3 were born in the US. Only 1/3 were not born in the US, although they do represent a larger, comparative to how much of the population they represent, they do have a larger number of folks that are in the low literacy level. But this is not simply about not being familiar in English. And I'll go slow for our sign language partners. You will see when you get the slides, I have references for all of these data. And this assessment is called, the acronym is PIAAC. And it is the Program for the International Assessment of Adult Competencies. And obviously it was done in every country, but we're focusing on the US skills. So again, can't tell by looking, and more than half of adults are going to struggle with information in written form. Numeracy. This is dealing with numbers. It is even worse here. And numbers are hard for everyone. I peddle in words. That's how I make my living. Numbers are not my strong suit. So I have a lot of empathy for these folks. And numeracy levels, same thing. We're looking at, level 1 or below. It's 62%. So well over half of adults struggle with numbers. The types of tasks that people in that low level or below realm would struggle with: making calculations with whole numbers and percentages. We're not talking decimals, we're saying whole numbers. Estimate numbers or quantity, and interpret simple statistics in text or labels. So any data at all that is just presented but not explained could be problematic. And white adults make up the largest percentage of US adults with low levels in numeracy, followed by Hispanic and Black adults. And roughly 39% of white adults have low numeracy skills, 28% Hispanic and 26% Black, respectively. And the last, you can't tell by looking, here's our digital problem solving. These are skills needed to access and interpret information in digital environments, which is everywhere from your local library to renewing prescriptions to a lot of the content Disability Rights California publishes, right? And that includes folks that are in level 1, struggle with sorting emails into appropriate folders based on their content, and determining how to return a lamp, for example, purchased from an online store. So an education level absolutely matters. 2/5 of adults without a high school diploma are not digitally literate. So the more education you have, the more likely you are to be proficient in digital problem solving. And anyone with children knows that these kids have grown up with digital devices at age. This may change, particularly as our older generations pass and younger generations for whom text is the norm get older, but this is the case today. So our last point, for practical reasons why we're here today, is it's the law. And there's something called the Plain Writing Act of 2010. President Obama signed it into law. It requires federal agencies use clear communication that the public can understand and use. And basically, any information that's needed for obtaining federal government benefits or services, describing or explaining how to comply, has to be in plain language. And all federal agencies must designate an official for plain writing. They must develop internal procedures, train agency staff like you're receiving today, and publish a compliance report. And the Center for Plain Language out of Washington, DC, whose board I sat on for 3 years, is sort of the watchdog organization that grades these federal agencies on how well they comply with these federal plain language standards. And we have a fun award we give out called the WTF Award, which stands for Work That Failed to Communicate Clearly. And that goes to organizations that put out really awful content that is difficult for people to understand, and the public gets to nominate those. So that's the extent of the teeth behind this law, but there's some fun shaming that goes on. And I think that the biggest opportunity for the public really is to take their business elsewhere. If your website is too difficult to navigate, find a competitor who's willing to invest in user experience. If the content is too complex, see if you can take your business elsewhere. Unfortunately, for folks getting services from the state, they don't have that opportunity. And that's why it is so important that organizations like yours and the regional centers and the state departments all use plain language. And I want to draw your attention on the screen. There's a little green bookmark at the bottom next to the words Federal Plain Writing Guidelines. That is your visual cue that you can find a link to those guidelines in the resource section at the end of this presentation. And you, again, will get this slide deck. You don't have to write all this down, and you will get that link. But the bookmark is letting you know I've included that resource. So we've talked about the practical reasons for plain language and why we're here. Let's talk about what really motivates me to do this work. I've been in this field for 22 years, studying the value of plain language and practicing it, putting research into practice. And it's primarily for the reasons, the social justice and the equity reasons. And equity is a guiding principle, but really at its heart, it means everyone has a fair and just opportunity. Everyone's talking about equity nowadays. It's wonderful. I don't know that everyone has a real firm plan for what they're doing about equity. And today I would posit to you that plain language is a way you can do, something you can do to achieve equity on behalf of those you serve. So if everyone has a fair and just opportunity, how do we ensure that? Well, first we have to identify and remove obstacles. And that's what we'll be talking about today. So here's an obstacle to voting. And this is a literacy test. This is from Mississippi. It's from the National Museum of American History. And so literacy tests were outlawed in 1965 with the Voting Rights Act. And as usual, it takes a little bit of time. The rest of the country stopped using them in 1970, which isn't that long ago. And basically the deal was folks that went to register to vote, the literacy test was used to disqualify people. You had a board that would interpret the results. Basically, it was a way to keep poor people of color off, disenfranchised, and requiring folks who had precluded from getting an education to then pass a literacy test in order to exercise their constitutional right to vote. So we think of this as a relic. It's in the Smithsonian for a reason. However, I'm not sure it's entirely different than, for example, obstacles to informed consenting. So in a recent study looking at 24 medical centers around the country, I do a lot of work for UCSF. I started my career there in the 90s. I can tell you it is still a problem. The average adult in the US reads at grade level 8. This study, looking at consent forms from 24 different medical centers from around the country, found the average consent was written at grade 13. We'll talk a little bit later how readability is not the only yardstick by which you can measure how easy or plain language something is, but it is an important measure. And I can tell you, based on the work I get, not just UCSF is not alone in this front. I work for counties, they struggle with it too. Consents are full of legalese. But what happens is you have people signing away their rights when they fully when they're not fully informed about what it is that they are agreeing to, the risks, the benefits. And this research has borne that out. So this is a real present day example of an obstacle we all face. And then what about obstacles to staying safe during COVID-19? The pandemic and the experience of the conflicting communications we heard from the CDC, from the federal government, from state governments, from counties around mask mandates, who's eligible for testing. People gave up. I mean, the pandemic made the case for plain language. We need improved language, particularly when it comes to these high-risk situations like maintaining public health. But we've all lived through this, and this is just one extremely recent, painful example of how a lack of clear communication can cause harm. So my question to you, and please, this is where there's a Q&A function on, if you either scroll to the bottom or top of your screen, you'll see a little Q&A button. If you click on it, my question to you is, what is an obstacle you've encountered and how did it make you feel? And if you want to share, type it in. I would be delighted to read. And I'll tell you the reason I got into this work. Why in the world would anyone choose to be a plain language expert or strive for that? I didn't. I was in marketing communications, and I was diagnosed with an autoimmune disease at age 20 and did not understand. For a good 5 years, I really struggled with what my doctors were telling me. And I had a couple of instances where I had conflicting prescriptions, and I realized pretty soon that if I didn't get a handle on what get a handle and start speaking up for myself and saying I don't understand, that something bad was going to happen to my health. And that's when I decided there has to be a better way. And I started studying plain language. So let's see. So for my case, it was very personal and selfish. Let's see. Alice said she received mail in a different language. IRS forms, amen. Just filed taxes, and I had to pay someone to help me with that because it seems impossible to do. Especially if you own your own business, it's too complex. Clear communication between staff. Legal writing, yes, felt frustrated. We'll talk about legal writing. Yes, Lucas, my grandkids seem to speak a language all of their own, it looks like. Yep, absolutely. I have 20-year-old twins. Sometimes I need a translator. Yes, assumptions about the language I spoke, absolutely. Financial aid, preparing for college. Yes, financial literacy is a huge challenge in this country too, absolutely. So we've all been there. Let me shut the Q&A so I can. So we just talked about plain language attitudes, which was kind of the first milestone we were crossing. Basically, we talked about understanding is the key to engagement. Adults prefer clarity. We saw that, and these national assessments certainly bore it out. Not only do they prefer clarity, and that's been borne out in plenty of studies, they need clarity because of the skill levels we're talking about. We know that complexity promotes inequity. If you want people to be fooled, if you want to be non-transparent, then by all means make that content complex. No one will be able to engage. And the one piece I want to leave you with is, when I came into this field 22 years ago, it was very much, and I came into it through the healthcare portal, it's very much blame the patient. The patients don't understand. Patients, it's their fault. They haven't done their research. They need to go look things up. No. Blame the patient, blame the consumer, those days are over. The reality is responsibility for clear communication falls on the communicator. And if my patient, if your consumer, if your client does not understand, that is your problem and your responsibility, right? Because that's why you go to work every day, to help them. And you're not doing your job unless they understand. And so that kind of shift in who's responsible, it's not the audience's job to figure it out. It's your job as a communicator to ensure and confirm, do everything you can to make sure they do. So move on to this concept, though, that literacy levels can flux depending on, sorry, it should say literacy levels can flux depending on the context. That's right. So this idea that we are all, you know, if you've got someone who's a PhD, lots of assumptions around someone with a lot of education, that they're very, very intelligent, probably so, and that they're highly literate because they probably had to read a lot and write a lot to get that PhD. But what about when that very smart person, we'll just say the rocket scientist, for example, let's say that rocket scientist is afraid, frustrated, angry, distracted, rushed, or exhausted. Think about that rocket scientist has just gone to the doctor's office and heard that they have cancer. That literacy level is going to hit the floor. It doesn't mean they don't have their PhD still. It doesn't mean they're not intelligent. It simply means that the context has sort of put a wet blanket on all of their literacy skills. This happens a lot in healthcare, and we refer to this as health literacy, your literacy level in a healthcare setting, because in healthcare, we're usually in relationship with a health system when things aren't going well. So just knowing, and in your world, you have folks dealing with legal issues. That is stressful. That is, you're already feeling like you don't understand because the law is complex. You don't know all of your rights. So you're already in this, maybe feeling a little more helpless than you would in your everyday life. And so literacy levels can plummet too. So it's just an important concept to keep in mind. I want to touch on the types of literacy skills because we talked earlier, there was literacy, numeracy, and that digital skill set of navigating using computers, navigating today's world. But if we're just talking about literacy, there are 3 types: prose, document literacy, and numeric. And the best way to illustrate those is using a nutrition label. And that's what we're showing here on the screen, is just an average nutrition label. This one happens to be for ice cream. So 3 examples, and I'm going to turn my cursor into a little laser pointer here. So prose literacy, that's reading. Down here at the very bottom, you see the ingredients section. The ingredients: cream, skim milk, liquid sugar, water, eggs, blah, blah. That reading words, that's an example of prose literacy. The second, document literacy. We come up here. Document literacy involves looking at information maybe in a table and going down to find, let's see if we can find how much salt. Well, first of all, here's the word sodium. I don't know, it's a big joke in the health world why they don't just say salt instead of sodium. But we've come down to find the word sodium, and now we have to come over to find out how much sodium is in it. 55 milligrams or 2% of my recommended daily allowance, right? So document literacy is going down and over. Appointment slips are another example of document literacy. The third is that quantitative literacy. That gets into those numeracy skills, right? So in this example, we've got a serving size of ice cream is a half cup. I can't remember the last time I only ate a half cup of ice cream when I had ice cream. Usually I'll eat maybe a whole cup or maybe a cup and a half, let's say. Well, if I'm on a salt restricted diet, I need to take that, a half cup serving and then multiply that 55 milligrams of sodium. Let's say I eat a whole cup. I have to multiply 55 times 2 and do that math, right? That is your quantitative literacy, having to do math to be able to act on the information that's in front of you. So nutrition labels a perfect example of prose literacy, ingredient section, document literacy, navigating all of these topics and then going over to read what the percent is, and then the quantitative literacy, multiplying things, doing some math to get the meaning. Does anyone have any questions? Let's see if I can let's see, I'm going to undo this little pointer so that I can pull over the questions on that. Yep. Yes. Okay. Someone indicated they think attorneys struggle with liability concerns and lean back on legal language for fear plain language may not cover quite the same info. Oh, we'll talk about how to go beyond that barrier. It is possible. I've done it lots of times with counties even, working with attorneys on, there is a middle ground, and we'll talk about that. Thank you for bringing that up. Okay, let's move on. So we talked about, Roberto mentioned this one of the objectives of the presentation is that the causal pathway, basically how in the world does talking in plain language or communicating in plain language influence what happens on the other end? Does it make a difference for people? This is what's called the propose, because it's a newer field and there's still research being done, but this is looking like the causal pathway, and the citations for all of this literature is included in the notes section. You'll get the presentation, and I invite you to read more, or we can have a conversation. The idea is I am who I am, so I come at this information with whatever capacity I have, whatever education level I have, whatever life experiences I have, and then your organization puts information in front of me, right? Whatever that is, if it's an article on your website, if it's a form. So my capacity to process whatever it is you put in front of me is going to influence my knowledge, so what I learn from it. And then that influences how confident I am about my ability to act on it, and my motivation, is this something I feel urgent about? Which in turn influences my behaviors and whether I'm going to make a change and follow through on that advice or not. And then you get to your outcomes. So let's talk about a real practical example. If you were to hand me information about steps I needed to take to avail myself of some services, for example, if I didn't understand it, my knowledge would not increase, because I can't engage with it. It's too complex. So I'm not going to learn anything. My confidence might start sinking, because if I don't understand this, how am I ever going to fix this problem? How am I ever going to get these services? And I'm certainly not motivated, because I have no confidence about my ability to do what you're telling me to do. My behaviors are not going to change, and my outcomes are going to stay on the same trajectory they're on today, which may not be a good one. On the other hand, if we use a different scenario where the information you've given me is in plain language, not only do I learn something, my knowledge increases when I read it, but I suddenly feel confident I can do this, and I'm motivated to get those services. So my behaviors change, I take advantage and take the actions I need to, and my outcome is I'm benefiting, right? So it's all about the input. I bring my capacity. Each one of us brings our own, brain and experience to the party. But that information is the wild card. That's the input. And that's where we can, if put in plain language, we can set in motion a positive, like a domino effect. So we've just talked about the attitudes. We've talked a little bit about some of the nuance. Now we'll get into what's called plain language knowledge. And this is really the nuts and bolts of it. You all, as I mentioned, I think got a tip sheet by email that will reflect all of the things we're going to talk about readability, understandability, and actionability. So my hope was that you would be able to just sort of, we'll get through this fairly quickly, and you'll have your tip sheet there. And then for the second part of what we do after our break, you'll have your tip sheet. And then when I'm showing you some of your content on the screen, you can evaluate it against that tip sheet. So, but just stressing the point that, again, you have all of this in that one-page document. So basically, plain language consists of three things. I'm going to talk about these real quickly before we move to the next slide. Information is considered plain language, and think of a three-legged stool. If it's readable, if it's understandable, and if it's actionable, which means easy to act on. A lot of times people stop at if you use Word on your computer and you have it set to score your content, it uses one calculator called the Fleisch-Kincaid calculator. There are lots of readability calculators, but Word uses that one, and it will score your content. And people say, I'm good to go because it's scoring at grade level 6, grade level 7. Do you want to sit on a three-legged stool or do you want to sit on a one-legged stool? In general, three-legged stools are a little more sturdy. And my advice is to not stop at readability because those calculators are easy to trick. And that's why we're going to spend time on each of these. And just keep that in mind when you're getting ready to publish something, when you're getting ready to put a form before someone, you want to think, is this the best three-legged stool I can put out there? And that's sort of the setup for the next few slides. So let's talk about leg number 1, readability. Basically, I told you already, the average adult reads at grade level 8 in this country. So we try to target readability grade level 6 to 8. There's a giant asterisk there because readability is not the be-all end-all of plain language. So this is just sort of an ideal benchmark. And the way to make content readable is to avoid words with 3 or more syllables. So on the one hand, for most words, you can find a simpler alternative or find a combination of words that have fewer syllables that get at the same thing. So we call that using familiar words, or like I said, using more than one. Other times, though, we have to use 3-syllable words, and we'll talk about that. So again, back to the calculators and getting that low score, if you minimize the number of 3-syllable words, and you use shorter sentences, 20 words or less, you are going to score at a low readability level. And I'll give you an example of why this is a problem. If you stop here, because the word blah, B-L-A-H, is 1 syllable. So you could type out blah, 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 period, blah, 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 period. And that document, fill a whole page with that. That document will score out at grade level 4. But it is not understandable and it's not actionable. It doesn't say anything. These readability score, that's sort of like the window dressing. You want to actually go inside and see if there's anything there. So readability is, does it look nice on the outside? All right, but let's get to the stuff that really matters. And that's the understandability and actionability. So we see that the green bookmark symbol, that means I've linked a couple of readability calculators on the resource page. Basically, the easy way to score your text, and this can all be done by hand, and those notes are included in the slide, but nobody I know does it by hand anymore. We use these calculators. You essentially copy and paste your text into a box on the calculator site. you go through and clean it up a little bit. You don't have to count proper nouns or non-prose content like a web address that someone's not going to read that for understanding, or a phone number. So you do a little bit of cleaning, and then you hit calculate, and it will kick out a readability score, a US grade level equivalent score. And it will say something like, this would be generally accessible to individuals who read at grade level 8, parentheses, you know, what age is grade 8? Like 13 to 14-year-olds, for example. So that's what you get. Calculators too, the reason that I recommend doing it online and not doing a hand count, which again, nothing against that, but it's just, it isn't efficient, and the calculators will actually highlight problem words. They'll highlight all the 3-syllable words and then give you the statistics about your sentence length. What that does is tell you, oh, you know, I've got very few problem words, very few, you know, complex words, but my sentence length is 25 to 30 words. That tells you where you need to start editing. So that's it, very simple. The bottom line, they help you quickly see where you need to simplify language, shorten sentences, but they do not help you make your content more understandable or more actionable. So we'll get into what steps you can take to do that. So again,
Jennifer, this is Jenny. We had a question from Callie, if you don't mind me interrupting,
sure.
because for the Q&A, she said, since she is deaf, she's not sure what 3+ syllables mean. Can you give some examples?
Yes. So a 3, and I apologize because I don't know if this translates through ASL, but I'll try my best. The word information, when you speak it out loud, we speak it in chunks. And for each chunk, we tap our finger. Information. I tap my finger 4 times. Information is a 4-syllable word. And please let me know if that was informative. But that's an example. Drive, 1-syllable word. Comma, 2-syllable word. So Jenny, I'll let me know if I need to provide some further clarification there.
She said, thank you.
Excellent. I'm glad it helped. And thank you for the question. Making content understandable. There's a lot to this one, and I've broken it up into header sections, which you'll see is a plain language trick, right? We give you a bold header and then we put some bullets underneath. So basically, under organization, put the most important information first. I can't tell you how many times a client comes to me with a document and they've buried the lead. And burying the lead means, you know, what is this about? Oh, by the time I get to the 4th paragraph, I see. And that, as a writer, that is a very arrogant way of communicating, because it's assuming you are going to spend your precious time reading what I've written. And as a writer, you can never assume that what you have written is so compelling or so important that people will give you their time. So put the most important information first. It is a show of respect for your reader. And by that same measure, avoid content overload. We don't need everything about the subject. We need the key points. Show me where I can go to learn more. So those are the 2 key principles of organization. Grammar, a couple of, this will take you back to high school, using the active voice and avoiding the passive voice. So active voice is Joe drove the car. Passive voice, the car was driven by Joe. And basically the passive voice is if the subject is at the very end, that's a problem. A more fun way to test if your sentence is passive voice, and again, you'll see the little bookmark there. That means there's a passive voice detector resource in your resource section. A fun way to detect it is if you can end a sentence in the 2 words by zombies, and it makes sense, you've got a passive voice. So let's try it here. Active voice, Joe drove the car by zombies. That does not make sense, so we're good. The car was driven by zombies. If we replace Joe with zombies, we know we've got a passive voice problem. We need to go back. Hold on. I think there we are. Using the Oxford comma, you'll see on the screen, that's just that extra comma before the and. So Joe bought milk, comma, bread, comma, and eggs. And basically what it does is it creates for the low literacy reader a hint there that that is another item in this list. It doesn't offend high literacy readers, but it helps low literacy readers. And that's the key to all of this. None of this offends someone who reads at a high level, but it does aid those who do not. And there have been studies that bear that out. If you're interested, I'd be happy to forward those. When it comes to health information, adults of all literacy levels prefer health information written at grade level 5 over grade level 10. Because no one, and I've trained doctors all over the country on plain language, and I always ask, raise your hand if you've ever had a patient say, could you explain that in more complex terms? Everyone laughs, no one raises their hand. Nobody wants more complexity in their life. They may want more information, but not more complexity. And then finally, avoid semicolons. We just make it 2 sentences. Semicolons are hard to do properly in the first place. Go for a shorter sentence. That'll help out your readability. Layout, bold headers, that whole bold header thing, just like I'm showing on the screen here. You've got a bold header and then you follow it with some bullet points or with a short paragraph, maybe 5 sentences max. So 5 is an important number. No more than 5 to 7 bullet points or 5 sentences in a paragraph. Use accessible fonts, minimum 12 point. I usually try to make everything 14, particularly if I'm writing for anyone over the age of 50, and especially if I'm working with vulnerable populations. Not everyone has vision insurance or access to affordable eyewear, and I will be 50 this year, and I can tell you your eyesight is not the same at age 50 as it was at age 20. So do your reader a favor. Certain fonts are better depending on the mode. So print, you're seeing print on the screen here. We're doing, digital. We've got print and digital. We're gonna go to that bottom bullet for a second under layout. For digital, we always want to use a sans serif font. Those are the round fonts. It's what you're seeing here on the screen. These fonts don't have little feet at the tops and bottoms. A common example of a sans serif font is Arial, very rounded. For print, you want sans serif fonts for your headers, but you use serif font for your body text. And a serif, see the little feet under the word serif body text in those 3 words there. Serif fonts have little feet, and for low literacy readers, it helps their eye see where a letter starts and ends. If you open any book, most books I've noticed are printed in serif because they're paper, and it's just a common thing borne out by research. Design, blank space, more is more. Don't fill it with clip art. The eye needs blank space to be able to navigate effectively from section to section. So think really hard about whether that's worth filling blank space with icons, etc. If you are using icons or symbols, make sure they mean the same thing to most people. Just because it means something to you doesn't mean it will mean the same thing to your readers. And one of the biggest challenges right now, frankly, writing for me is, what do you use for a telephone symbol? Back in the day, it would be the old rotary phone or the handheld. Now, I don't think my 20-year-olds would know what that was if they saw it, because they just know the cell phone. So sometimes we just offer the word phone instead of an icon. And then use colors or shapes or a box to call out key points. Draw the reader's eye where you want it to go. Don't hope that they will stumble on that very important paragraph. If it's that important, put it into a box. Again, I know we're going through a lot here. It's all on your tip sheet, but I just want to at least speak to some of them because we'll be applying them after the break. Use numbers or numerals, 1, 2. Avoid words, right? Spelling them out. Classic example in healthcare is on pharmacy labels, pill bottle labels. Give this pill once daily. ONCE. In Spanish, ONCE is once. It means 11. And that there have been cases where there was a nurse that I knew whose patient had misdosed, not through any fault of their own, but because the pill bottle should use numbers, and the regs have changed. So you should really only see numbers on pill bottle labels now. We do that in text as well. Use sentence case. Only capitalize the first letter of the first word. That helps someone who's a low literacy reader know where that sentence started. You can find it immediately. You just look for the capital. And we avoid all caps, italics, and fancy fonts. I'll show you some examples on the next slide. And we always left justify. That means lining text up on the left. It leaves what we call a ragged right margin. That helps the eye go from line to line. So let's look at some examples here. We've got on the top, we've got centered text. And as you're reading it, this is taken right off your website. It's hard to see when your line, the next one starts underneath the top one. So it's harder for the eye to go line to line versus the example on the bottom, which is left justified. That's that ragged right margin. Okay. Another example of serif or sans serif font, right? The standard fonts. This is an example at the top. We see the sentence case, the capital. We've got 2 sentences here. It's easy to find where each one starts. The examples on the bottom, the first one is all caps. Very difficult for the eye to quickly see where each sentence starts. And the very bottom example shows a fancy font, one of the fun ones we have to choose from on Word. But again, it makes it hard for someone with low literacy. We don't have the serif feet, and it's just a trickier, more stylized font. It just makes your reader pedal uphill. We want them coasting downhill. And then we're going to move on to actionability here. Basically, this is just, can your reader, you've given them all this information, can they act on it? Can they do what they need to do? It's amazing how often you get wonderful, great content, but you realize, oh, they didn't put a phone number. They didn't put a website. Or, for example, in my grandfather's case, he's 98, he got a letter where they only put a website. They didn't put a phone number. That was a problem because he doesn't have internet access. So you want to make sure you add all the key information for whatever space your audience may be in, right? Not everyone can afford Wi-Fi. Not everyone can afford the internet. We've had our public libraries closed. That hasn't helped folks. Have a physical address. At very least, if they can't access you through the web, they can come and see you. And then clearly state the ask. Don't bury the lead. Put it at the top. This letter talks about X, and you need to make a choice by such and such date. Okay, now I know something's being asked of me, and then I can read on to find out the details. Important to address the reader directly. It's just more engaging. Say you can. You can dial 1-800 blah, 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 and ask for help. It's very direct and very specific and action oriented. Using checklists, you'll see that on the plain language tip sheet I gave you. I use checklists so you can go down and check things off. Offer navigation tips. Let someone know once you get on XYZ web page, look for the red button in the upper right hand corner. Don't make them sit there and figure out where to go next. That's a navigation tip. And then again, we talked about this earlier, don't ask people to do math, do the calculation for them or provide an example that can lead them or aid them in doing their own calculation. We know numeracy is a major problem. If we flip it from the low numeracy to who has high numeracy, only 9% of adults in this country have proficient numeracy skills. That's 1 in 10. That's a huge, you'd be making a huge gamble to assume people could do the math. And this is the last point before we go on break. Testing content with your audience. So we can do all of these things. We can design the perfect content and make sure it checks off all the things on the tip sheet. But the true test is with the audience. They get to say whether or not it's complete, it's understandable, it makes them feel good. And so testing with your audience, just 5 simple questions can yield terrific improvements. And I'm going to tell you in a minute, it doesn't have to be a big, expensive endeavor. But just asking someone, is it easy to understand? Can you find the main point? It's not a test, but did I make the main point evident? What words make sense or don't? Can you do what it's asking? And someone may say, well, I can't because I don't have a smartphone. Oh, I wouldn't even think of that. I assume everyone has a smartphone. So then you know to add, you don't have to access an app to do the task. You can also call a certain number. You can also go here. Is there anything missing? Is it concerning to you? And is it offensive to you in any way? And that gets a little more at the cultural competency. Words in English do not necessarily mean the same thing in other languages. And we never want to assume that just because it's fine for an English speaking audience, it's going to be fine for individuals who speak other languages. And so always asking a subset of your audience, if you know that it will be accessed by individuals who speak another language, get their opinions. And then the easiest thing or the best reason for doing this is your audience will tell you immediately what needs to be changed. And then you can do that and you can validate those, change it and take it back and say, is this closer to what you were recommending? And I mentioned this doesn't have to be a big, ridiculous endeavor. Recent research on usability has recently shown that basically the magic number is 5. If you test with 3 users or have 3 people review it, you'll catch 65% of the issues. 4, you get to 75. 5, you get to 85. 85% of the issues will be caught if 5 other people look at it. Now, the reason I show 12 users is 99. Why does it take so long, more than double, to get to 99 from 85? Well, basically, after 5, you're going to get people who are repeating things. In the qualitative world, we call that convergence. You're going to start hearing the same things over and over and over again. So it's going to take another 7 people for you to get all the way to 99. And generally, if you get to 85, you're going to be pretty close. Most of the things will have surfaced. So that's a lot. I know we're 5 minutes past the hour. I'm going to just say what I have just spent the last hour talking to you about, it isn't hard. This is the easiest to do. It just takes commitment. That's it. And, I would say being an attorney is hard, or being a disability rights advocate is hard. That seems very complex to me. I don't do that. for a living. It takes a lot of training and a lot of knowledge about the law and the regulations. But this stuff I'm talking to you about is not hard. It just takes a little extra time. But if the result is your audience feels like they've learned something, they feel confident and motivated and like they can do what it is you're asking, then the outcomes will be better. And I think that's probably the goal for everyone on the training. So with that said, we've reached break time. What we'll do is we'll start again. Why don't we, I'm going to cheat you out of 1 minute of your break, but why don't we come back together at, what do we have, 1:15? And we'll start on some practice. So I'll see you in just under 10 minutes. Okay. Well, I was looking over some of the questions during the break, and one of the excellent questions was regarding legal language and really the challenge. Obviously, I know doctors are in the same boat. You go to school for a couple of years to learn this whole complex vocabulary. And a physician I know said, her mentor, when she graduated, said, you've spent the last 5 years learning 64,000 new medical words. Don't use any of them with patients. And the same could probably be said for what you learn in law school. I do want to take a minute to acknowledge the fact that the legal world is experiencing a sort of a plain language movement of its own. And a colleague of mine, Christopher Trudeau, he's at University of Arkansas. He's an attorney, but he's also a plain language advocate. He has published a couple of pieces on his researching client preferences for legal communications. And he's got 2 fairly recent studies that show clients prefer plain language by a wide margin over traditional legal language. And it's roughly 80% of clients prefer clear language when given the choice. Interestingly, judges were roughly about that level too. The links to both of Christopher's studies can be found on the slide Plain Language Attitudes. It was a little further up in the deck near the top. So you have that. So check out the Plain Language Attitudes slide and you can read Christopher's research. He speaks eloquently on the subject, but again, this kind of falls into the informed consent. It's very legal. It's like a contract someone is signing, saying they acknowledge X, Y, and Z, and agree to certain risks and benefits. But when it's written at a level folks don't understand, there's nothing informed about that consent. So we're going to talk about some of the ways that we can, and I'll show you some examples of ways that I've helped the state translate legal language into plain language. So hopefully some of these practical techniques will help. If you have your tip sheet available, you want to have that maybe up on your screen, this is where we'll be using it. But first, I'd like to start with just some verbal techniques for making sure you're communicating in plain language. So analogies are sort of a verbal tool we can use to relate something unfamiliar to something familiar. So an analogy would be, your heart is, or the arteries in your body are like a garden hose, for example. And what happens to the plant at the end of the hose if there's a kink in the hose, or the hose gets clogged and the plant doesn't get water? It dies. Well, in this example, it's explaining to someone what happens to the heart muscle when there's a clog in one of the veins and it gets clogged, and then blood can't reach the heart. Well, that heart muscle dies, and that's can cause a heart attack. So that's just one example. You can come up with a million of them, but it's a way to say, you know, I know someone understands the concept of, you know, a cake has frosting and it has the cake. So make up an analogy where something is the frosting and something is the cake, just something very common, right? It's something we can practice here in a minute. And then, you know, speaking in plain language, it doesn't always have to be finding another word that means the exact same thing. It can be finding a combination of words. It can be saying, I'm going to use an analogy to explain the concept of conservatorship, right? So there are creative ways. These are some of the words that stood out to me when I went through your website and looked at your materials that probably would be challenging to folks if they weren't already familiar. So if you could pop open your Q&A, I would love to see what plain language alternatives you can come up with for any of these. And I'm gonna take, because I spend a lot of time in the health world, hospital discharge. That's one of my favorite ones. Date of discharge. You hear that all the time. Most people think about discharge as something leaking out of your ear or leaking out of a wound. In the medical world, it means the day you leave the hospital, right? So there's one. All right, test. Yes, test is one syllable, test. And test is a plain language alternative to assessment, a 3-syllable word. Excellent. Excellent. I know conservatorship is not that one's more analogy prone probably, or it'll take a couple sentences. That's okay. It's okay to use more words. The point is to promote understanding. Readability is only one leg of that stool. Understanding and accessibility or actionability are two equally important legs. So it's going to be a trade-off. Reasonable accommodation. What do we have here? A different way of doing a task. Love it. And once you come up with these, it becomes a glossary in your head, and you can start using, instead of the word participate, 4 syllables, I always use take part. 2 words, 1 syllable each. It just becomes automatic. Anyone else have any that they want to try? Regulation. That's a regulation, 4 syllable. I know sometimes it's, especially in law, and it happens in medicine too, you want to be exactly technically right. But a regulation is it's a rule, right? And the regs are generally enforceable. Technically, I know it's a reg and not a law, but you could use those terms too, to relay the fact that this is something that we have to pay attention to, or you have to pay attention to. So rule or law would be alternative there.
Jennifer, if you scroll down, people have started putting things inside the question and answer. Not a problem.
This would be harder. Okay, regs, rules, perfect. There you go. You guys, you've got this. Discharge, right? Yep. Oh, conservatorship. I like that. Someone makes decisions for you. Excellent. Right. This is natural. You're all naturals at this, and you'll see when we get into the examples of what I see on your website. I could see already that you all are expert at practicing and speaking in plain language and writing. So I just have a few tips. All right, we'll move on. So the teach back technique, another verbal way to, this is for checking for understanding. We just talked about speaking in plain language. This is to check to make sure what you have explained is understood. So it's two parts, easy. Explain a concept or a process. And step two is ask a client to explain it back to you in their own words. This is not a test of what the client knows. It is, though, an indication of how well you communicated. And the way to do that in non-shaming language is to introduce the fact that I want to make sure that I explain that clearly. I know I just gave you a lot of information. And so I want to make sure that the most important points were clear. So what you can do is say, when you get home, how would you explain this to your partner? And that's a great way to get someone to articulate things in their own words. Or you can use scenario-based practice. So tell me what you would do if, someone came up to you and said this or did that, and have the individual try to apply it. And then you can see what components of what you were trying to communicate are missing, and then you revisit those or reinforce those. And that's called the teach back technique. So let's get into some practice. And again, if you have your tip sheet handy, you can certainly use it to examine. We're going to look at some information that's published on your website to see, is it easy to read? Is it easy to understand? And is it easy to act on? So the first example is from the article, Coronavirus, Face Masks in Schools. There's the link showing on the screen if you want to actually open the thing up, but I'm going to, I put screenshots of it on the next few slides. You don't need to do that. So I scored your original content, that article, and I used the calculator that you have the link to in the resource section. Basically, the readability score came back at grade 13. There were 34 sentences, 709 words total. There were approximately 1 in 5 words were complex, which means they're 3 syllables or more. And that's okay. There's no magic number there. We'll talk about that. But average words per sentence, 21. And we learned earlier, 20 is kind of the max. So that's a flag. And I put a green star, that's thumbs up. That's something excellent. Only 1 sentence was passive voice. And I would say it's probably okay. So you're doing great. So let's just look at a couple passages. I'm going to tell you what stood out to me. So this is the very top of the article you see pasted here on the screen. A star is a plain language win, and a red arrow says where we have an opportunity. So wins, things that really stood out as you're in the right spot. The whole article starts with a brief summary of key points. You're not assuming someone's going to read the whole thing. They can tell by reading these top few sentences exactly what this article is about. It's very respectful. And you define a key term. What's an accommodation or modification? So, fantastic. One opportunity I saw to improve understandability is to draw the reader's attention to this summary. This summary, if you can see, is the exact same font size as your body text. It doesn't stand out in any way. It's not all bold. There's nothing that would say, other than the fact that it's at the top, start here. So what you could do is draw the reader's attention by using a larger font size for that summary, saying, hey, this is more important, or put a box around it, or make it a different colored font. So that's just one opportunity there, but on the whole, beautiful design. Another set of wins. First of all, that if you look at the content on the web, and I've just cut and paste all of the headers here, content is organized under bold headers. And these are the bold headers you see pasted here on the screen. So basically, someone could just peruse the headers and go right to the section that they are most interested in. Excellent job. All text was left justified. And this material appears on your website, and it's all appearing in sans serif font, which is, again, the best practice. And the text, and I'm just showing the headers here, the questions, but the answers all address the reader directly, most of the time, with the word you, which is another, that's one of our actionability principles. So it's very personal. So again, excellent example. So these are two passages here that, and this is consistent in this article. We've got the headers and the bulleted lists. You never have more than 7 bullets, which is excellent. Remember, 5 to 7 is kind of our sweet spot, and you hit it. That's fantastic. One thing you could do to improve actionability is, in this section, what is the most recent California guidance on mass? We've got this information here, here in the bullets, but then this link just appears at the end. There's no text describing, you know, what the link is. I would actually have to read the link and get to the end, and I see guidance -4 face coverings, and it would be helpful to just have a little sentence that says the following, you know, follow this link to read the state's guidance, something like that. But again, examples of win after win. So now, remember the readability score at the start, I said it was 13. And if that was the only, if you were just using a one-legged stool to measure this, you'd be saying, this is not good. But you have all of this other, these other principles working in your favor. You have understandability and actionability. This is why we try to we go in, don't just judge a book by its cover, open it, see what's inside. You're winning here. These are excellent. So let's get to that readability problem. If we want to bring it down, which we will, this is where we might want to start. So we've got 2 columns here. The column on the left are words or phrases that can be replaced or modified, and I picked these out. The column on the right consists of words that build required vocabulary. So all of the things on here are not plain language. They're either 3-syllable plus, or they're technical terms or abbreviations, etc. But not all 3-syllable words are bad. And the reality is, for this audience, they need to understand certain words like accommodation, modification, discrimination, disability. Those are important vocabulary building words. We don't want to wipe them out of this piece. Are they going to drive up our readability score? Yes, but that is why we don't measure content purely by readability. It isn't a true measure of a communication's worth. But the phrases and words on that left side of the screen are ones where we don't need them. We can find plain language alternatives. So again, I'm going to open up Q&A. Go ahead and type in if you've got plain language alternatives. I'm scrolling to the bottom. Participate, I already gave you the answer to that one. Take part. Anyone want to type in? All right, we've got join, another excellent one for join. Sometimes join, though, can make people feel like they have to sign up, to like they're joining a club or paying dues. So that's something to be just cognizant of. Adjust, fix, yes. Recommend, suggest, yes. Individuals, people, thank you. There's no need to use the word individuals. It can be people. Adjust, change. Determine, decide, excellent. Yep, you've got this. Yep. Get instead of receive. And here's the thing. Receiving, 3 syllables. Receive, 2 syllables. So sometimes it's just changing the tense of the word can get you there, right? Yeah, very good. E.g. I don't like. I'm one of those people that always has to refresh my memory about is it IE or EG, and EG means such as, but just say such as, because EG is not plain language. I think it's Latin, right? So I'm going to avoid that. And then for the words that do build vocabulary, those are ones obviously medical. Most people understand medical, but other ones you may want to define, again, trying to build that vocabulary. But they're just going to be there and they're going to drive up your readability and may not get any lower. But you've defined them, and building your reader's vocabulary is a way to build their literacy level. And it is a very honorable pursuit. So the other challenge we saw with this content is sentence length. We saw an average sentence length, I think, of 21. One of the things on your plain language checklist, remember, is do not use semicolons. And the way that this is currently written, it's making it all one long sentence, right? So my recommendation is to replace semicolons with periods at the end of each bullet. Now, people will say, oh my gosh, you can't make a bullet a sentence. Technically, you can if you are going to adjust the intro. So in this case, the intro language is, for example. But what I would do, look at what I've suggested at the bottom of the screen here. I'm suggesting you say, there are many reasonable accommodations and modifications that schools may be able to provide, period. Accommodations can include, and then each bullet with that intro, each bullet functions as its own sentence. Different types of face coverings and our face shields, period. And each one of these would become its own sentence with a period. That will lower your readability. That will shrink that sentence length. So just doing the 2 things we just talked about, which is very cursory. We simply came up with some plain language alternatives for words that could be reduced and adding in periods at the end of those bullets. And that took, all of 2 or 3 minutes. We've already reduced the readability score to grade 11. You could probably get it lower by, instead of repeating the word accommodation 10 or 12 times, you could maybe only use it 4 or 5 times and consolidate that content. You could probably eke it down to grade 9 is my hunch. But you get the picture of how to bring that content down readability wise. But I hope you will also take away the fact that that article was an example of how to do it right. It was not content overload. We used bullets, we used bold headers, and it was easy to navigate. I do want to address 2 questions I saw in here about the idea of using you again and again and again. Boy, the question is, I've cautioned about using the word you. If one starts several sentences with the word you, it's hard to read and receive the info. It's like pointing a finger at the reader. Absolutely. When done poorly, and the classic example is a bulleted list of 10 or 12 things, and each one starts with you. And you're right, you should just have a finger pointing emoji there. That doesn't feel good. So the better way to do that is to have a lead-in sentence that says, you can choose from several options, and then have your bullets listed. You don't need to have each one be a you. And vary up your writing. Not every sentence has to start that way. So that's one thing to be aware of. So I thank you for bringing up that point. Be cautious about it. And then another question, can I address the issue of document readability versus document accessibility? 2 different things. Readability is merely the sentence length and the number of words per, or syllables per word. Accessibility gets to the stuff that we talked about under the understandability section of your tip sheet, right? That gets to enough blank space. That gets to the font size. That gets to the space between lines, the length of lines. If you go to the Federal Plain Language Guidelines, you could go down this plain language rabbit hole. We don't have time to do today, but there are a lot of little things you can do to help make documents accessible. One big thing is, you notice on these screens here, the screen, I'm using black font against a light background. There are online accessibility sites where you can make sure that, and your site does an excellent job of this, not all sites do, where you've got enough contrast between the background and the font. Because marketing departments like it to look good, but looking good doesn't necessarily always translate to accessibility. So those are, I would say, look to the understandability section of the tip sheet, and those things get to accessibility. And we can talk more about that at the end here. I want to just show an example of another piece I saw on your website. This one, stimulus, how to get payments. Complex topic. Let's just start there. Tricky, right? There's the link if you want to read the whole thing. What stood out to me was this section. And to be fair, I just took a section of that article. There were plenty of other sections in the article that were much shorter. But this one stood out to me as ringing the bell for content overload. We want to avoid content overload because the reader tunes out, right? So to improve understandability, I would use headers that describe the text. And when you look at the header, it says vaccines and testing. The text, though, that relates to vaccines and testing is just that first paragraph. The rest of it is not about vaccines and testing. So the header isn't matching all of the text. What happened here is a bunch of text got thrown under that one particular header. So what I would recommend doing is simply maybe either changing the header to be more reflective of what's really talked about here. And when you read it, what's really talked about is it's the COVID relief package. And then you could have subheaders. So this section of text you're seeing here on the screen, I came up with 6 different possible subheaders. The first paragraph is vaccines and testing. The second is unemployment benefits. The third is paid leave. The fourth is renter protections. The fifth, food assistance. And the sixth, funding for care and advocacy. So rather than someone skipping, there's a lot of good information here, but it's just chunked. Help them navigate it by adding some of those bullets. So that's just one example where taking a little time to break it up will help your reader get the very important information out, because this is very intimidating. And again, it's tricky material. So I want to take a minute to talk to you about another way to approach this legal content, right? There's in law, and I heard this in one of the earlier comments, you want to be accurate, right? And one way you can approach this is with what I call the quick guide approach. Anyone who's purchased a car, an appliance, gosh, iPhones don't even, or cell phones don't even come with instructions. They're so intuitive. But anything big that you've purchased usually comes with an owner's manual, which is that thick, or a quick guide, which is a small piece of paper that just has a few points. And most people just look at the quick guide because no one wants to read the owner's manual. We don't have time, we're not interested. And that's the same approach here. So at the start of COVID, the pandemic, I did some work with the Department of Developmental Services. And basically the department was putting out directives about, now that we're shutting down, what can you expect? These were really important pieces. And this is an example of one. So this is a directive on requirements waived due to COVID-19. And this stuff was changing week by week. But obviously reading this, these things are scoring out very high, and they're not necessarily accessible. So what we did is we developed a quick guide template that would give someone the gist. And the gist means just the high level stuff. What do I need to know? And then tell them where they can go to get more information. So here is an example of how this, the original, this was turned into this. This is our quick guide. Here's important notice. And you can see this is a plain language layout. You can navigate that left margin going down, looking at those questions, what to know, your options, questions, and learn more. Very simple. And then we use the bold headers, we use some bullets. And basically what you're seeing on the screen now is a 6th grade version of the directive you saw on the previous page. So readability level 6, plain language content, organization, and layout. It hits all of the things on our tip sheet. And there's links for questions and where to get more information. So for some people, this is enough. Okay, I got the gist. For others, they say, ooh, I still have more questions. I want to learn more. We made that actionable for them. The only thing missing was we went round and round, call your local regional center or contact your regional center if you have questions. We couldn't list a bunch of regional center phone numbers, but that was the only actionability piece that I wasn't thrilled about. But this quick guide format ended up being what they adopted, the department did, for all of their COVID communications. And DDS has now hardwired this quick guide approach. If you go to their website, and you can go to the department directives page, I just am showing the one the example I showed you from March 2020. You can click on the guidance, right? Which will take you to the original, or you can click on the summary. That's the quick guide. And the summary has been audibly recorded in English. The summary has been translated using ASL. And then the summary or quick guide has also been translated into all the languages shown there. And they have done that for most of the directives ever since. That's great, because my job is to come in, teach you how to fish, and leave. And they learned how to fish and are doing that now. And they've tweaked it a little bit, and I think it's fantastic. But it's an approach used that is working, and now is accessible and easier. Rather than translating the whole thing, we're just translating the quick guide into these languages, and people can get what they need. I've included the link there to the department directive site. I'm sure you're all very familiar with it. So I wanted to share that as another approach, rather than sort of a word for word translation, just cherry picking the high level pieces, but letting people know where they can go to learn more. That appeals to folks that are at the low end of the literacy skill continuum, as well as those that are busy, high literacy. They just want to get the gist, and they know where to go to learn more if they need more and want to dive in. So I know we're at Q&A. I just want to share a few closing thoughts with you. Putting lipstick on a pig. This I talk about a lot. We come across so many documents in life that are, sometimes I get my phone bill or cell phone bill and I think, I just need to know how much to pay. I don't need 7 pages of content here. When we are faced, and we all are faced with content that is not clearly written, but when you are faced with maybe court documents that are not clearly written or in legalese, and you're trying to help a client, these are some tips for how you can turn that inaccessible document quickly into something that maybe is easier to navigate. You can use a highlighter, highlighting the main point, highlighting the key things that need to be done and how to do it. Highlight the phone numbers. You can just grab a different color pen to make any clarifying notes in plain language. Remember, this means, put the form in the mail by this date, not it's received by this date. You know, just little things to clarify. And then always include a phone number in case someone has questions. But, you know, until the world is all plain language, you know, these are some of the coping materials or coping mechanisms we can use. And then another thing like DDS has done, they've built sort of that, they've hardwired the plain language, and your organization is building a plain language culture. You're training staff. We've done this a couple of times. Another thing you can do, like the feds, you know, designating staff to serve as a plain language resource, using templates, quick guide templates, for example, or the templates you're using to put content on your website that we pointed out how they're reflecting plain language principles. Call out boxes, that type of thing. You've got those tips now. And then having, you know, a small advisory council or a group of maybe 5 people you can go to that are willing to look over a document or two each month, or review things. And then you can put a stamp of approval, have them design a little logo that they can put at the bottom that says, you know, client approved. Something that allows them to show that, you know, this has been put through its paces. And then my last ask of you is, as you encounter content, as you encounter experiences, ask yourself, is this process or system set up so everyone can reliably understand it, navigate, or act on it? And if the answer is no, then you know now how to start removing those obstacles. You all do that anyway. You do this, you know, more than 40 hours a week probably for a living. But when it comes to material and communications, this is, you know, where to start. So here are your resources. Again, links to all the things we talked about. And I'll leave you with this. Option 1, do you have any questions? Option 2, what questions do you have? The difference here is option 1 is closed-ended. It can be answered yes or no. And when you ask people, do you have any questions? They default to no. But when you ask them, what questions do you have? You are saying, I assume you have questions. You are assuming that you weren't 100% clear. And so I leave our Q&A or start our Q&A with that. So I will open the Q&A, or if you want to unmute, I'm happy with. And Alice, I think your question looks good, but why wouldn't you left justify too? I think you're talking about maybe the quick guide. It's left justified in the answer column, but the question column was there so you could navigate immediately to the information you wanted. It's just another way to do it that is in line with plain language guidelines. Let me know if that doesn't answer your question.
Also, this is Roberto. Feel free to raise your hand. We can unmute you if you'd like to make a comment or a question. So Gary, I believe you had a question.
I'm not seeing one in the Q&A. Roberto, are you hearing it? No questions. Okay, great. I'm glad it was helpful.
Debbie has a question.
Hi, good, wonderful training. But my question is like something involving conservatorship. Let's say I want to write something to tell people in plain language all about conservatorship. So I say conservatorship is when somebody else makes decisions for you. Can I continue then to use the word conservatorship, or what are my options?
Yes, excellent question. The answer is yes, you can continue to use the word conservatorship because you have explained it. And I would go so far as to say it is, and I'm going to show my ignorance here, but it is it's a legal status that may be, you may want to explain a little bit more about what it is, but absolutely, once you've explained it in plain language, continue to use it. I wouldn't overuse it. If you can use the word it if you've referred to conservatorship in the previous sentence, but it will drive up readability. But again, you're building that vocabulary. So it's perfectly reasonable.
Okay, thank you.
My pleasure. We have 5 minutes left. If anyone has questions, and my contact information is on the last slide. I'm more than happy to email Roberto or email me directly. Oh, someone's asking about embedding hyperlinks in digital material for accessibility purposes, specifically for people who use screen readers. It's a best practice, but I saw you did not do that. So it depends on whether or not your content will be distributed digitally or in print. And there are a couple of challenges here. One is, if there's a chance someone will print off your document and get it in print format, a hyperlink's not going to help them because they won't be able to navigate there. So let's talk for a minute about print. If you're looking at a print document, my recommendation is always to take them to the main page, because agencies, companies, organizations redo their websites all the time. And that link, if it takes you to the specific page, the minute they redo their website, and they're not going to tell you about it, that link and that content is now out of date. So I generally recommend you take them just to the main site. And if you're not confident that the website's easy to navigate, you can guide them in your instructions to that section. So rather than giving them a link that's 2 lines long, because if they're going to type it in, they're going to make a mistake. We all will. In terms of the accessibility for screen readers, you could, obviously you want it to be accessible for the screen reading population, but there's the other population that may not be using a screen reader. So you want it to work for them too. If it's only going to be online, you again can just have that be a link and have it embedded. That's perfectly fine. But again, I wouldn't recommend having it embed directly to where you are telling them to go. Have it go to the main site, because I'm redoing, for example, for the North Los Angeles County Regional Center, redoing their consumer and family guide. A lot of links in there to a lot of resources. And from draft 1 to our current draft, a lot of those links no longer work because people overhaul their websites. Let me know if that didn't answer the question. I will add too that I will defer to you all on the accessibility standpoint, because you probably know far more than I do. That's your area of expertise. So let me know if there's something I'm missing.
No, I think that's a great response. Also, recently we're trying to stay away from tagging to PDFs. So every time we link something, we link it to the website, to the actual HTML page and the web page, instead of linking to PDFs. The PDFs do expire, or anytime there's a change, there's new PDFs and that link isn't outdated. So there is that.
So for the DDS website, in that case, if you go to DDS, the main website, it has boxes underneath. When you go on the landing page, one of them is directives, right? Departmental directives. My recommendation would not be, you could link to the directives page, but if they ever get away from that taxonomy, your link's not going to be good. So it's okay maybe to go 1 or 2 layers deep, but I wouldn't go a few layers deeper than that, because then you run the risk of changes disabling things. How do I feel about infographics? Excellent. Infographics are fantastic if they're done right, because they're a quick way for people to get the gist. It's a visual quick guide, right? We just looked at a prose quick guide. It's almost a visual quick guide. And they can be especially helpful when it comes to conveying numbers. So for example, you notice on the literacy and digital numeracy page, I showed symbols, an array, 1 out of 3, 1 out of 5, rather than just putting, 20% up on the site, because that gives people an array. They can picture what that means. And infographics are a great way to say, your risk of this happening is 2 in 10, and you can put 10 little people and shade in 2. So I think if you're using plain language, if your colors are accessible to people, you've got good contrast, they work for folks who are colorblind, the font's large enough, great. I just wouldn't over design them so that it feels overwhelming and someone doesn't know how to navigate, but another excellent tool. And I know we are at time. There's my email. You're, again, more than welcome to email if you have questions. Roberta knows how to reach me, and more than happy to be a resource if that's helpful. And thank you for your time today, and thank you all for the work you do.
Thank you, Jennifer, for this great presentation. So much useful information, really, we truly appreciate it. Again, this presentation will be available also on Thursday, the 27th. So if for somebody who couldn't make it, or if you want to watch the training again, we'll be here at the same time, 12 to 2 on Thursday. And again, we are recording. So once the video is available, we'll send out the link for everyone to see, and also keep the great tip sheet for references. And if there's any questions, feel free to reach out to me or Jennifer as well. Thank you, everybody. See you Wednesday.